Hi, it's Nicole. One reason to read authors and works across different ages is to see them talking to each other. For example, how Angela Carter uses Shakespeare's characters in her novels, and how Shakespeare uses snippets from ancient Greek and Roman stories in his plays. Quoting Professor Foster, "Literature grows out of other literature. We should not be surprised to find, then, that it also looks like other literature. Once you know that, you can go looking for old friends and asking the attendant question, 'Now, where have I seen her before?'" As the table of content of how to read literature like a professor humorously points out, when in doubt, it's from Shakespeare. That's chapter 5. Or the Bible. That's chapter 6. Foster gives many examples of authors using images, verses, and stories from the Bible in their own novels. And he explains how he recognizes a biblical allusion from an example from James Baldwin's story, Sonny's Blues, from 1957. And today, I'd like to try to explain how I recognize and interpret biblical allusions using some examples from Titus Groan. I will show you what the biblical allusions are and what I think they signify. Titus Groan is the first book in the Gormenghast series by Mervyn Peake, published in 1946. Titus is a newborn baby at the beginning of the novel, the heir of the vast Gormenghast castle. The current Earl of Groan, Titus' father, is a quiet and depressed man who feels shackled by his endless and meaningless ceremonial duties, although he never questions them. Titus' mother doesn't care about her children or anyone except her pet birds and cats. And Titus also has a 15-year-old sister who, for a large part of the novel, is the narrative point of view. The storyline doesn't matter too much for our purpose here. We are going to look at one chapter and zoom right in. It was the day of the Earling, where the infant Titus, the 77th Earl of Gormenghast, would be officially installed as the lord of the castle and the title. The chapter starts with, "The day of the Earling was the day of rain." So, first of all, before anything else, there was the rain. Rain can go two ways. Either it's a thirst-quenching, life-giving, positive thing, or it's the relentless, depressing, or even life-threatening negative thing. What kind of rain is this? Monotonous, sullen, grey rain with no life in it. It had not even the power to stop. It looks like the second type. There's no life in it and it can't stop. It's the type that will carry on going until it floods the earth and swallows up all life. Next, the author draws our attention to a piece of garment multiple times. Here is the first time we see it. Nanny was ironing the white linen smock, which would reach Titus' ankles. It was blanched to an quality as of white light. We now hear Nanny speak. It's a monologue that drops a lot of hints. Quoting Foster, there's definitely something going on in the text that seems to be beyond the scope of the story's immediate dimensions. So it's come to this. Nanny was talking to herself. So it's come to this. The tiniest thing in the world to be an earl today. Today! Oh, my weak heart. How cruel they are to make a tiny thing have such responsibility. Cruel, cruel. It isn't righteousness. No, it isn't. But he is the Earl, the naughty mite, the only one, and no one can say he isn't. Oh, my poor heart. They've never been to see him. It's only now they want to see him, because the day has come. This paragraph is full of religious intonation, even though Nanny had no idea what she was talking about. She had no idea that she was probably prophesying. Look at the sentences in the middle first. how cruel they are to make a tiny thing have such responsibility. Cruel, cruel. I kind of want to say, Nanny, stop being dramatic. These are over-the-top comments, which is characteristic of Nanny. Yes, Titus is still a baby and he is going through a kind of coronation, but what responsibility would he have at this stage? None. Why is this cruel? He's been crowned, not sacrificed on an altar. There's nothing cruel about it. And the fact that she says responsibility wrong means that it's very likely when she said it isn't righteousness, she means it isn't right. She couldn't say a big long word like responsibility, and she probably didn't know what a big long word like righteousness mean. But the author puts righteousness in her mouth and in front of our eyes. It's religious language. If you are familiar with the Bible, righteousness is a key concept, and the word appears many times. If you read the novel at a normal speed, you only spend about 30 seconds in this paragraph, so I don't think the author expects the readers to come to any conclusions. But these do bring to my mind one baby in the Bible who later in life did shoulder an immense responsibility, who was treated cruelly, and who was called the righteous one, the only one. I think at this stage, the author is still building the foundation for something, and this monologue is one of the bricks. A very effective one, in my opinion. He's putting together a jigsaw puzzle of a picture, and this is one of the pieces. We pick it up subconsciously as we head towards that bigger picture. Then we are back to the rain outside. The steady monotone of the pattering rain was depressing enough, but for it to descend on such a day was sheer gloom. It was as though it defied the castle's inmost faith, taunted it with a dull, ignorant dissent of blasphemy, as though the undrainable clouds were muttering, "What is an earling to us? It is immaterial." Note the religious language again, faith and blasphemy. The castle's deep-seated faith was built on the expectation that law, rituals, and ceremonies were to be carried out exactly to the letter. To rain on such a day was disobedient to the castle and the law because it hindered the rituals. But the elements didn't care. People gathered around Gormenghast Lake. The rain came down on all. There was no ending, and the great lake swelled. People's clothes were soaked and dripping. On her lap was Titus, drenched. Here's the second time the author draws our attention to Titus' clothes. On her lap was Titus, drenched. Even so, the smock she had been so carefully ironing looked miraculously white, as though it gave forth light instead of receiving it. Earlier, the white linen smock was compared to white light. Here, its white light quality was increased to miraculously white, as though it gave forth light. Titus' clothes were radiant. And back to the rain again. At this extreme, the stable boys in the top branches of the walnut might as well have been sitting in the lake. They could not have been wetter. At this point, I was kind of thinking, all right, I get it. It's very wet. The whole world is underwater. You've spilled enough ink. Now please get on with the story. Before the author gives us the climax, though, he says it again. His white smock clung to him so that the form of his little body was divulged. The clinging cloth was luminous. I want to make 2 points before we go on to the climax. I think it's fairly safe to say the author is trying to make a point with this radiant white smock. What is his point? Where have I seen people with radiant clothes before? There are not many literary figures whose outfit matches this description. Let me know in the comment of any other candidates, but the person that came to my mind is Jesus at the Transfiguration, recorded in 3 Gospels. There, Jesus was transfigured before them, the disciples Peter, James and John. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. That's from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, verse 2. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. That's from Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. And that's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. To be fair, there are other characters, even in the Bible, who wear pure white clothes besides Jesus, so you can say it's just an indicator and not a deciding factor. We'll just hold on to another piece of the jigsaw puzzle for now. The second point: what's the significance of all this rain and people getting very wet? Let's consult Professor Foster. There are 2 chapters on rain and water in How to Read Literature Like a Professor. First of all, if it rains in a novel, it's rarely by accident. If it rains in a novel, the author puts it there for a purpose. In the chapter on rain, Foster goes immediately from rain to drowning to flood to Noah and his enormous boat. My 3 most memorable literary encounters with rain and flood are in The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence, The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot, and The 9 Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers. All 3 have the flood as their climax. Okay, we don't have a fully fledged flood in our story, but the heavy rain plays a similar role. Remember, the author specifically says the stable boys sitting in the tree might as well have been sitting in the lake. They could not have been wetter. Closely linked to that, there are also a lot of characters throughout literary history who drown or nearly drown. If they go for the second option, they usually come back to life a changed person. That's the imagery of baptism. Death and rebirth through the medium of water. This is less obvious in our story yet because it depends on what happens when the rain stops, but just keep that in mind as well. Now the climax. The climax of Earling's ceremony was to have the new Earl installed in the middle of the Gormenghast lake. This one scene simultaneously evokes 3 iconic images in the Bible. I believe this is the big picture that the author has been building up to. Titus' father was a teenager when he was installed, so he swam to the middle of the lake, and it didn't rain. But Titus was only a year old, so he was pushed on a raft and left alone in the middle of the lake. This scene gives a chill down my spine every time I read it. I will do a commentary as I read. As soon as Titus was proclaimed the Lord of Gormenghast, a hush, most terrible and unearthly, had spread and settled over the lake, over the wood and towers, and over the world. Stillness had come like a shock, and now that the shock was dying, only the white emptiness of silence remained. For while the concluding words were being cried in a black anger, 2 things had occurred. The rain had ceased, and Titus had sunk to his knees and had begun to crawl to the raft's edge with a stone in one hand and an ivy branch in the other. And then, to the horror of all, had dropped the sacrosanct symbols into the depth of the lake. An otherworldly and universal silence descended on the scene, where people from the castle and dwellers from outside the castle gathered to watch the ceremony. The concluding words being cried out in a black anger was referring to the master of the ceremony, a bad-tempered old man called Ba Quentin. He was angry because Titus wouldn't hold the symbolic stone and ivy branch, as was decreed by the ancient law. And now, even more shockingly, Titus dropped the sacred objects into the lake on purpose. And you probably picked this up. The rain finally stopped. In the brittle, pricking silence that followed, a section of delicate blue sky broke free from the murk of the clouds above him, and he rose to his feet, and turning to the dark multitude of the dwellers, approached in little careful paces to the edge of the raft that faced the side of the lake where they were gathered. His back was turned to Ba Quentin, to the Countess his mother, and to all who stared transfixed at the only moving thing in the porcelain silence. The rain stopped and the blue sky appeared. The natural world was responding to this new lord. Titus showed his will through his action for a second time. The first time he dropped the symbols of the law. Now he turned to the dwellers and turned away from Ba Quentin, who represented ancient law and history, and away from his mother, who represented the royal lineage. Had a branch broken in any one of the 1,000 trees that surrounded the water, or had a corn fallen from a pine, the excruciating tension would have snapped. Not a branch broke, not a corn fell. In the arms of the woman by the shore, the strange child she held began to struggle with a strength that she could not understand. It had reached outward from her breast, outward over the lake, and as it did so, the sky began to blossom in azure, and Titus, at the edge of the raft, tore at his necklace with such force that he found it loose in his hands. Then he lifted his head, and his single cry froze the multitude that watched him on every side. For it was neither a cry of tears, nor of joy, nor was it fear, or even pain. It was a cry that, for all its shrillness, was unlike the voice of a child. And as he cried, he swung the necklace across the sparkling water, and as it sunk, a rainbow curled over Gormenghast, and the voice answered him. Just let that sink in for a moment. What has just happened? I said there are possibly 3 overlapping biblical images here. Let's look at the most obvious one first. After the rain and the flood, there was a rainbow. According to Foster, the rainbow is one of the most recognizable symbols in Western literature. The main function of the image of the rainbow is to symbolize divine promise, peace between heaven and earth. God promised Noah with the rainbow never again to flood the whole earth. No writer in the West can employ a rainbow without being aware of its signifying aspect, its biblical function. It's a symbol of God's promise, it's a hopeful image. What Foster doesn't specify is the reason for the flood in the book of Genesis. It's because the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. This is from Genesis chapter 6. Could it be that the rain in our story came to wash away something bad as well? Could this something bad be the meaningless traditions and the life-sucking law? Combining the actions of Titus throwing the stone, the ivy, and his necklace into the lake, I think the author means for Titus to stand against them. The second biblical image is less explicit, but I think the image of a baby on a raft on a lake resembles another baby in a basket by a riverbank, aka Moses in the book of Exodus. Moses, as a Hebrew child, was adopted into the Egyptian pharaoh's family. He could have lived as an Egyptian prince, but he chose to leave wealth and glory behind and identify with his oppressed and enslaved people. This image of the leader of the oppressed fits well with Titus symbolically turning to the mud dwellers and away from the high and mighty from the castle, but this is more implicit. For the last image, let's just read the last sentence of this paragraph again. And as he cried, he swung the necklace across the sparkling water, and as it sunk, a rainbow curved over Gormenghast, and a voice answered him. How would you like to finish that sentence? A voice answered him. I immediately expected the voice to say, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," which is the voice from heaven after Jesus came out of the water at his baptism in the river Jordan. Titus was drenched by the rain. As the author forecasts earlier in the chapter, he couldn't have been wetter if he was in the lake itself. The rain stopped. Titus came out of the water, gave an unchildlike cry, and a voice answered him. You have to read the novel to find out how the voice answered him. Mervyn Peake makes use of many biblical images throughout the story and invokes the feeling that this is not an ordinary installation of an earl. This is something extraordinary. This child is unearthly, the chosen one. Peake makes him the 77th Earl of Gormenghast, the blessed number 7. What difference do these biblical allusions make to our understanding of the story? Quote Professor Foster talking about his example in a different novel. Is my reading greatly enhanced by this knowledge? Perhaps not greatly. Something subtle happened there, but no thunder and lightning. The meaning doesn't move in the opposite direction or shift radically. If it did, that would be self-defeating, since so many readers would not get the allusion. I think it's more that the ending picks up a little greater weight from the association with Isaiah, a greater impact, pathos even. I'd say the biblical allusions are a bit more significant in our case, but I agree with him. It doesn't always matter very much, like the example in The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. So what do I get from these allusions? This was a flood and a baptism. The rain symbolically drowned them all and destroyed what was from the past. I won't read this, but the author implies that the castle died as the ceremony happened on the lake, and as the ceremony finished, the castle came back to life. It's a baptism and rebirth of the castle and the world of Gormenghast. The rainbow symbolized hope for a new world. The earling of Titus Groan ushered in a new era. What kind of new world and new era was this going to be? One clue is that he was installed as the next Earl of Gormenghast, but not according to the old system. As we've already seen, he refused to follow the law, rejected the ritual, thus broke away from the old. So maybe this new world will center around a loving relationship, which so far has been completely lacking, instead of dead letters, of which the novel has been full to the brim. Another clue is that he identified with the poor and the oppressed and turned his back onto the privileged. So this new era might see goodness and gladness coming to the dwellers outside the castle. Titus is the chosen one to start it all off. And with the image of Noah, Moses, and Jesus, I'm hopeful he will bring it forward in the following books. It's a risky assumption to take because I haven't read the rest of the books in the series. Also, Mervyn Peake planned for at least 2 more books to come, but he died too young. So we'll never know what's his intention for the full picture, which I think is a great shame. But I'm pretty confident, not only because of the biblical images, but also the conclusion from the author himself. And there shall be a flame green daybreak soon, and love itself will cry for insurrection. For tomorrow is also a day, and Titus has entered his stronghold. Insurrection means rebellion, a violent uprising against authority. Am I reading too much into it? Did Peake have all these biblical allusions in mind? I can never be 100% sure, obviously, unless I ask him in person, but I believe he did. For one thing, he was a child of missionary parents who believed in the Bible enough to leave the comfort of their home in England and went all the way on the other side of the world. I don't know if he personally believed in the God of the Bible, but I'm fairly sure he would have been taught by his parents and would have been familiar with the stories of Noah, Moses, and Jesus. So that's my first attempt at explaining biblical allusions in a novel. Let me know what you think. If you find this interesting, I can make more videos like this. For example, I find the biblical allusions in the Nutcracker and the Mouse King very intriguing as well. But please let me know in the comments if this is something you'd like to watch. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.